Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Discussion Forum 2021 for, I think, what's going to be as excellent a session as this morning's was. This afternoon, we're going to focus on COVID and some of the AWS-sponsored research. But before we get into that, could I just point out to you that one of the things that we need for the Discussion Forum is some feedback on what you've thought of today and what you'd like to talk about in the future as well. So there's a feedback form which is in the event page in the chat section. The link is in there. If you fill that in before you go this afternoon, that would be absolutely excellent and will give us some idea of what we're going to do in May next year. So without further ado, let me introduce you again to Nick Powell, who's going to chair this afternoon's session on COVID.
Thanks very much, Chris. The title of the session this afternoon is Upholding Welfare in a Pandemic. And it's been on everybody's lips pretty much every hour of every day for the last 18 months or more. We've got 4 speakers who are going to give you presentations in groups of 2 for the next 3/4 an hour, a bit more than that. And then we'll have another 3/4 an hour or so for questions. So feel free to submit those at any point. They'll address different aspects of the pandemic, our 4 speakers, and how it's impacted on the veterinary profession and ultimately the welfare of our animals. So our first 2 speakers are Daniela dos Santos and Peter Ginman. Peter is chair of the Animal Welfare Committee, and we'll hear from him after Daniela, who is an AWF trustee and senior vice president of the British Veterinary Association. She very successfully chaired a session, as many of you will have seen this morning, and she had the very small job of being president when the pandemic started last year. Daniela dos Santos.
Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be with you today, even if it is virtually, to discuss how the global pandemic has or has not impacted on animal welfare. My aim in the next few minutes is to give an introduction on the various aspects of the pandemic and how it has affected animal welfare. And my fellow speakers will go on to give deeper discussions around the various topics. Good news or bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that I don't have a PowerPoint, but instead you have a monologue from me. Now, many of you will be aware that I was BVA president at the beginning of the global pandemic. Certainly not something anyone before me had prepared for or had any experience in. But it was an honour to be leading the profession through those difficult times. The day before the Prime Minister issued his first stay-at-home order, I hosted the first BVA Sunday COVID webinar, attended by over 7,000 people. The sheer number who attended took us by surprise, but I think this was simply a demonstration of the anxiety felt within the profession. Those initial 3 weeks were challenging, with the profession providing emergency care only, apart from those involved in food production. There was an overwhelming sense within the profession that we had to put public health first, and for the majority, an acceptance that for those 3 weeks, animal welfare was to be upheld in its purest form, the prevention of suffering. It would be wrong to say that there was a universal acceptance of the situation. The order to switch to emergency work only by the RCVS and supported by BVA came about due to the sudden announcement from the government and the absence of sector-specific guidance as to whether we could stay open or not. During those 3 weeks, not only were the profession able to uphold animal welfare in its most basic form, but it gave the profession time to plan and adjust to new ways of working. How do you carry out veterinary work, particularly in small animal practice, maintaining social distancing at all times? All sectors to a degree had to alter their ways of working in order to protect human life and prevent the spread of COVID. In small animal practice, these changes were the most dramatic. Clients were kept out of the building, teams were working in bubbles, reduced staffing levels to protect the vulnerable, and the result? Exhausted staff, but animals that needed to be seen were. The human impact of these ways of working, although I am mentioning it in passing, should not be overlooked. Whilst we are talking about the animal welfare impact, these are intrinsically linked to the well-being of those tasked with upholding it. And I know this is something Caroline will go into more detail later on. In the large animal and equine sector, the change was less significant. Working outdoors decreases the risk, and having large patients like horses and cattle provide a good visual representation for clients as to the distance they need to keep from you. For more specialist practices, such as poultry practice, the change was even less significant, as much of the work was already done remotely due to the regular and normal use of technology. For other sectors, especially small animal practice, technology stepped in to attempt to take some of the strain and fill the gap left by reduced efficiency and staffing levels in the form of remote consultations and remote prescribing. I suspect this subject will come up during the course of the debate as to whether or not it supports or harms animal welfare, but it remains in place to some degree to this day. After the initial 3 weeks, concerns turned to the longer-term aspects of animal welfare. There were concerns around how staffing shortage would affect livestock and the potential impact of staying on farm longer than necessary, for example, something I know Peter will go into more detail during his talk. There were also concerns in the small animal sector. How long could we continue to delay routine vaccinations? Until we had an outbreak of an infectious disease? How long could we delay neutering without having an unwanted boom in population, which would add to the demands on an already stretched service? It was interesting being in my position when the decisions were being made about how soon we should address these sorts of cases and how quickly we should be increasing our workload. In fact, I came under significant criticism when I suggested primary vaccination courses could be started at a particular point, as they could be carried out in a socially distant manner. On reflection, this was a human reaction to the terrifying situation of a global pandemic. We knew so little about transmission at this stage that for some, routine animal vaccinations and the movement of people associated with these appointments put others at unnecessary risk. For others, not starting would simply result in a disease outbreak that practices did not have the capacity to deal with, nor the PPE required, which was in dire need by the NHS. I have to say, to my knowledge, there were no widespread infectious animal disease outbreaks across the country. When it came to neutering, particularly cats, there was real concern from animal welfare charities that the profession was going to be responsible for the collapse of preventative healthcare in companion animals, especially the dramatic reduction in the neutering of cats. The reality is none of this transpired. The poll report this year has shown overall that all forms of preventative healthcare have been maintained, and in fact, the number of cats being neutered has increased. For many practices, while service provision has been maintained, it continues to look very, very different to early March 2020, and new challenges have come to the front. The pandemic is impacting on staffing levels, and the PFMA has reported that over 3 million new households have acquired a pet during the pandemic. This is something that was not foreseen, and is having a significant impact on animal welfare, often in ways out of the hands of veterinary professionals. Many people had a change of circumstance when the pandemic started. And with more people working from home, with their children at home, many thought it would be an ideal time to get a puppy or kitten without thinking of the long-term consequences. The reality is now 18 months on, the consequences are being seen. Many of these animals were not adequately socialized in those early weeks and months of their lives, leading to a generation of dogs with behavioral issues such as separation anxiety. Interestingly, it's not just those pandemic puppies presenting with these sorts of concerns. Many adult dogs have got used to having people around all the time and are now having to adapt again as owners go back to work and children go back to school. But for some owners, the pandemic has resulted in unemployment or a reduction in earnings, a concern that Steve will address when he talks about how the pandemic has impacted on the charity sector and the demands for their service. Will we as a profession have to consider what we call gold standard or appropriate levels of care? Are we going to have to educate owners on what to expect when it comes to treatment options? What impact will the necessity in some cases of adjusting treatment options for animals based on finances have for veterinary team morale or job satisfaction? So, whilst the last 18 months have been incredibly challenging, I am so proud of how the profession stood up, protected human and public health, as well as maintaining animal welfare. But it is not the end of the story. There are many challenges ahead of us that my fellow speakers will discuss, but the profession can hold its head high at how we all adapted and responded to a global pandemic.
Hello, good afternoon. Some of you will know me, but my name is Peter Ginman. I'm the chairman of the Animal Welfare Committee. And perhaps just a quick look at what the Animal Welfare Committee is to remind those who are not used to it. Many of you will be aware of FORC, which was originally the Farm Animal Welfare Council. That was in 1979 onwards, and it changed to the committee in 2011. And then in 2019, governments decided to take the F out of us, and we became the Animal Welfare Committee. And in so doing, we became involved with all species. Terms of reference, I've put it on the slide. Please don't attempt to speed read these slides, but we will have them available afterwards, I'm sure, for anybody to have a look at. But the basic ones there are there. But the important difference is the last line on the welfare of companion animals and wild animals kept by people. And that's been one of the big changes as the farm bit has been removed from FORC and become ORC. The other part of us that sometimes gets forgotten is we have the Welfare at Killing Committee. And for those who are used to initials, the government's joke, I think, in that, calling it WAC. And it meant that we were looking at the welfare of killing, and we have a duty under that on that basis to look at the aspects of that. And that's built in originally under Article 20 of the EU regulations and has been taken over now into current legislation in this country after Brexit. Different ways of working. We historically in FORC always worked with quite long reports, and they took 2-3 years to research. And we've tended these days to work much more quickly, to work with what are known as opinions. And the opinions I'm referring to today are there on the screen. You will see the reference, and again, that can be copied off later. First report we did was a rapid view, and the second was a later review of what we'd said, and also a little bit of crystal ball gazing as to what might have happened in the new year, then 2021. The point being that this is unusual in the sense that this particular approach that we've done here was one that instead of coming directly from government as something they wished us to do, which is the normal process by which AWC works, we actually suggested it to government and said it might be a good idea. We've got a very good membership who are very well connected into all sorts of different bodies and organizations, and we thought it might be useful to have a look at it. So this was something that, if you like, came from the membership itself. And I think it's really important, and I put on the bottom line there a very big thank you to all who responded to our call for input, because the response was great. We put it out through friends, through connections, through colleagues, and we got back some fantastic information that was really helpful and timely. Some, of course, did take the opportunity to put everything, including the kitchen sink, into it, which indeed was all of their lobby information. Didn't do any harm. We read it all. I can assure you it was all went through in front of us, and we had a look. So the first opinion findings, bear in mind, we were trying to look at this in a rapid way, because this first opinion was really based around April and May of 2020. And the responses showed fairly rapidly that we'd got problems of overstocking starting to appear on farms, rapid drop-off in demand for food species. As soon as catering disappeared, the catering demand, you can imagine that immediately there was an effect on abattoirs, and there was an effect on those delivering, and so on. And the result of that was some farms were finding themselves in difficulty. They were not only in difficulty with moving stock and housing, but also with regard to feeding. Catering waste, for example, which is not, I might add, swill, but is that which is left over in the catering world, is very often incorporated into rations for livestock. And suddenly there was no catering, so there was no waste, therefore there was a, where do we get this from? And that puts pressure on other sources of feedstuff, which were also being affected at the time because of importation difficulties. At the same time, you've got a problem of, can vets get on farm? Can people generally get on farm? And it was clear that there was a delay and a concern that some cutbacks would indeed result in welfare difficulties. Throughout this, you will see that I link health and welfare very strongly because the one goes with the other. And therefore, as soon as you start to look at some of the health issues that are arising as welfare consequences and whether or not they can be dealt with at the time. Manpower is always a problem, and getting the right number of people available when you've got a disease in the human, and particularly one that was so easily spread, meant that with the poultry industry, and particularly also in cold stores and in cutting plants, there was always a risk of spread that needed controls put in place, but also people were becoming ill and there was a problem of staffing. Audit and inspection schemes had to adapt. They were suspended, and suddenly the other eye, the external eye onto farming and farming processes was being reduced. In the horse world, problems of access, reduced supervision, lack of exercise became apparent as people could not get to, in lockdown, could not get to their horses or were restricted in what they could do and where they could take them. And that, of course, then has an effect on vaccination possibilities with a potential of build-up for flu issues at a later time. And obesity is a clear issue, subsequent laminitis may flow, and so on. So the linkage of health and welfare, again, showing through. And as I said, this is very much in the early stages. Were we getting it right? We'll have a look in a moment. Lack of exercise, obesity, companion animals was something that was very many of you said to us, this is going to happen. Inappropriate exercise and the risk of injury was something that was mentioned. Puppy socialization, the fact that actually breeding was becoming difficult. How could you move animals around sufficiently? Concern, obviously, from the welfare charities who very rapidly said, we're not getting the money in. How can we deal with all the things that we do, both inspection and looking after animals? And I think there's further comment from others today on that particular point. Obviously, any collections of animals in any form, whether they're wild animals or indeed those who are looking after various that are recovering, that relied on public visitor funds, that was disappearing, as indeed with the problem with people. So moving swiftly on to the second opinion, which was the later one, was basically looking at the period after June, and we reported in September. So we were picking up stuff. And we said, right, first of all, what did we get wrong? We were worried that sheep weren't going to get shorn. In fact, they did. That new feedstuffs and alternatives might prove not acceptable, and there might be problems as a consequence. On the whole, that didn't happen. And generally, farming coped pretty well. But the new and increased concerns were those that come from the very essence of how much of farming has become the just-in-time or short-cycle production. In other words, where the input has come, the egg is laid, the chick is born, the broiler is produced. But it applies not only to farm animals, it also to the small furries. The short gestation means that retailers suddenly found themselves with excessive stock. And fish production, perhaps not always in the eye of all veterinary surgeons, were really concerned about longer-term disease susceptibility because of problems of getting rid of the very stock that they'd carefully produced. I made the comment earlier about charity income. In the second opinion, it was very clear that that was becoming a much bigger issue and was growing all the time. Breeding had been reduced or postponed by many. Some had found in, say, the horse world that they couldn't move the animals around. There was therefore some risk of obesity, again, for a reason that they were not going to get looked after in quite the same way. At the same time, castration clinics were suspended, and vets were finding difficulty in actually just dealing with the emergency cases, and the routine was starting to drop away. So vaccination concerns were certainly being raised by many of you who responded in saying, well, what happens next? Will we see outbreaks of disease? Will kennel cough become rife? Will we see other diseases because we failed to get the vaccinations done in the way we would expect? And this grew markedly as the various responses came in. And obviously, as we were writing this, as I say, presented to government in September of 2020, that was what we were concerned we might see. Livestock concerns, feedstuffs continued, and indeed a poor harvest that year and a lack of straw was just adding to the difficulties. The suspension of TB testing in some areas, or the curtailment, indeed some farms just were saying, we don't want anybody on the farm, please stay away. The reduction, was that going to lead to a similar situation as we'd seen in foot and mouth, with more disease being apparent later in the year? I think the jury's still out on that one. But there's variations in different parts of the country in different ways. The increase in the keeping of companion animals was reported. A lot of you commented that you'd seen more cats and dogs being found homes for, more people wanting them. But with it was coming a very great concern about potential for abandonment. And I think others may comment on that, but certainly I've had quite a few comments, even recently, that this has become a greater issue, as indeed these animals that were puppies have got bigger and bigger, and people have returned to work. And unscrupulous breeding and therefore supplying the demand became noticeable. There was also some animal dumping of some species. For example, we saw some pigs being dumped in the Forest of Dean because people didn't know what to do with them. So usually, as ever, these are population problems, and the moment you stop the supply, you start to get problems, and with it, welfare issues when there's an oversupply of animals or a lack of homes or people to look after them, or no longer the wish to do so. I think the most important thing to remember is at the moment, it's not over. We're still seeing the effects. Our opinions were written, as I say, last year, and we were trying to use that crystal ball to look ahead. So I have no doubt the discussion that will follow from these papers now will probably open up some of these areas where people will say, well, you got that wrong, yes, or you may say, yes, but you didn't emphasize it enough. And I think it's important that we do consider how we look forward when we have such events as this. A key point that's always been in FORC or AWF is planning, resilience planning. Those who have animals have a duty to think, what happens if? And ensuring that that planning is done and proper plans are in place and rehearsed if possible becomes an important part of ever having, keeping, and having the responsibility for an animal. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Daniela. All four of our speakers are listening in intently, not only to their own recorded presentations, but to those of the other three. And I'm sure what you've heard already will provoke some questions, which we'll have, as I say, about 3/4 of an hour to go through once we've heard from our next two speakers, who are Steve Howard and Caroline Crowe. Caroline is head of training at VDS, and we'll hear from her after Steve, who is head of clinical services at the PDSA. Steve Howard.
Hello, my name's Steve Howard, head of clinical services at the PDSA. Part of my responsibility is to set the scope, the pitch, and the quality of the charitable services that we deliver at PDSA. As part of this discussion stream, I'm going to talk about a number of impacts of the pandemic on the charity and wider as we work our way through the pandemic and for consideration afterwards as we come out of it. I'm going to talk about the impact on pets, the impact on charities, some of the economic impacts of the pandemic, and some of the potential implications for the profession as well as charities. As far as impact on pets goes, hopefully you're all familiar with the PDSA Paw Report. We've just launched our 2021 Paw Report, and the recording of that launch with some fantastic speakers is available on Webinar Vet. It's also available as a report on our website at pdsa.org.uk. The 2021 PAW report was our 11th annual report, and it gives us a view of some of the long-term trends of pet wellbeing issues over the years, over the last decade and more. And we've run that report every year with a very reputable company, YouGov, and we've stuck to the same methodology throughout those years. So any trends that emerge over the years or as the result of something like the pandemic are visible to us, and we can rely on that data. We last ran the report back in 2020, partway through the pandemic, and we're able to identify some indicators of the impact that the pandemic may be having upon the well-being of the pets of the nation. And we ran it again in May of this year so that we could see what impact the pandemic had had on pet well-being after a full year of living through a pandemic. The first area to talk about, and is one that's been in the press, both professional and national, a lot, is the pet population. And actually the PAW report showed that there'd been no significant increase in pet populations throughout the pandemic, contrary to many headlines. We can rely on this data because, as I said, it is gathered with consistent methodology, so we can compare the results that we got this year to previous years with confidence. What we did, however, see is not necessarily a change in population, but a change in owner demographics, with, as it says there, significantly more pet owners who said they'd acquired their pet since March 2020, said that this was their first experience of owning a pet or that species of pet as an adult, at 47%, compared to those that had acquired their pet before March 2020, before the first lockdown, which was 33%. So we have a whole new demographic of pet owners who may not have the experience that previous new pet owners had, and who may seek veterinary care and veterinary assistance more than had been the case previously. There were concerns raised quite early on around the impact of the lockdown on people's ability to socialise their pets and their new pets, particularly, and the young ones. And the PAW report 2021 has shown that 27% of dogs that are newly owned since March 2020 showing behaviours that could be related to a lack of socialisation. And as we know, as humans, it has been difficult not to turn to snacking and food during the lockdowns. And our behaviours appear to have translated through into how we feed and treat our pets. And 9% of dog owners reported their pet to have gained weight since March 2020. And this adds to an already recognised burden of growing pet obesity in our pets, and could well be storing up welfare concerns for the future. As far as the impact on charities goes, the first lockdown, you can see there from this graph, which shows our service elements, both the face-to-face consultations that we were carrying out weekly, as the blue line. The grey line shows us the number of remote consultations we were delivering, and the orange line there shows us the surgical volumes that we're delivering through our pet hospitals. And the first lockdown obviously had a dramatic impact of that in March 2020. We moved from delivering 10 to 15% of our consultations remotely and the remainder face-to-face to 80 to 85% of our consultations were then, over a matter of a couple of weeks, transferred to the remote environment. And we did this in common with many veterinary practices in order to minimise travel, keep our clients safe, and to keep our teams safe during that first lockdown. And in the period since then, we've been working with COVID restrictions, which have severely impacted upon our capacity in the sites and restricted the number of people that we can have in the pet hospitals. So we've maintained that high level of remote consulting throughout very much the rest of the year in 2020, and the early part of 2021 as the second lockdown or third lockdown was in force. But you can see that more recently we gradually reduced the levels of remote consulting that we've been doing, and that resource has been moved back into site and translated into increasing levels of face-to-face consultations and surgery that we've been able to deliver through the site. And that has happened even more since that graph was produced. As far as making sure that we're delivering our services to the right patients, we've been monitoring our surgery, which we had prioritised as emergency, those that needed seeing there and then, and something needed doing. Essential, where some delay was perfectly reasonable before carrying out the surgery, or the full service, which are the more discretionary procedures. And what we were looking for was, we all absolutely needed to maintain the level of emergency services that we were delivering. And you can see from the blue line there that we managed to maintain that emergency care throughout the pandemic and to this day. But one of the challenges, as I've already said, is that the COVID secure ways of working, constraining our capacity in the pet hospitals, meant that we were limited for a period as to how much of that essential surgery we could deliver. But in the latter part of 2021, more recently, we have made a number of changes and been able to relax some of those COVID restrictions in our pet hospitals to start to recover some of the surgical services that we were able to deliver. One of the questions of moving to a largely remote consultation service is, has that impacted upon our patients significantly? And this here is an example of 10,000 patients a year we have on cardiac medications. And you can see that in 2018, 19 and 20, even though 2020 is based upon 85%, 80 to 85% remote consulting, that there has been no change to the average age at death of our cardiac patients, and no change to the in-year mortality in our cardiac patients. And that column doesn't suggest that there's a 40% chance of a new cardiac patient dying in year. It's any patient that's received cardiac medication that then dies in that year. So many of those patients will have been on cardiac medication for a number of years. But the conclusion there is that actually remote consulting and remote care can give us the same welfare outcomes and patient outcomes as the way we were operating before, in a largely face-to-face manner. In terms of preventive care, that again was one of the service elements that was quite severely hit by the pandemic. We made the difficult decision that we could start reintroducing preventive services as we progressed through the pandemic, or we could concentrate on delivering our treatment services and particularly those emergency services to as many patients as we possibly could. And we made the decision that we wanted to make our charitable services as available as possible for people that needed us when their pet required care. So we are still at a point where preventive services we have not yet had the capacity to reintroduce preventive services to anywhere near the levels that we were delivering in the pre-pandemic world. In discussions with some of our colleagues in other charities, obviously the rehoming world has seen many impacts of the pandemic as well. And the levels of relinquishment and rehoming demand have changed significantly during the pandemic. And our colleagues have had to adapt to the pandemic ways of working as well. And what we're looking for across many charities is to retain some of the adaptations we've had to make throughout the pandemic, where they have provided us with benefit, and we see that there is a benefit for those ways of working into the future, that we want to keep some of those. So remote consulting, and where the codes allow, prescribing is something that we at PDSA are looking to continue where we can. And I know some of my colleagues in the rehoming and shelter medicine environment are looking to continue on with virtual rehoming where they can. And going forward, I mean, there was a lot of talk about the economic impacts of the pandemic throughout the pandemic, and the government has managed to delay many of those economic impacts through, for example, the introduction of the furlough scheme or the increase in benefits that they provided throughout the pandemic. But we know furlough is about to end, and whether that will result in increasing numbers of redundancies is a major concern for us as a charity. And we already believe that we're starting to see pockets where demand for our services is starting to increase. And we're still concerned that test and trace and the impact of the pandemic having constraints upon our ability to deliver volumes of services. So the rise in demand for services obviously leads us to be concerned that we need to have the ability to meet that demand. And of course, as a charity, we have reserves, and we've earmarked some of those reserves to try and help us to upscale our services and prepare in our ability to meet the demand. But unfortunately, the current situation in terms of availability of veterinary surgeons and the difficulties in recruitment mean that where we've identified we could put more clinicians into some pet hospitals to help us to meet that demand, we're often just not able to do it. And the question there, I suppose, should it just be charities that are concerned? I think the economic impact on pet owners is not just felt and seen through the charities. It could well have an impact upon private veterinary surgeons and their clients' ability to afford veterinary care going forward, which I'll explore a little bit later. Just to reinforce that, Joseph Rowntree report 15 million people living below the poverty line, and I saw a headline recently saying that the removal of just that £20 uplift in universal credit that the government provided would drive another 500,000 families potentially below that poverty line. So this is a real concern going forward. The Poor report again explores affordability of veterinary care, where 7% of owners report to us that they're increasingly worried about how they'll pay for their vet bills if their pet falls ill or gets injured. And a number of those have already had to get help from others to help affordability of vet care. So the impact on the profession, as we all have seen, it's been in the professional press and in the national press that there's a current mismatch in demand for pet care and the resources that we as a profession have got available. And that's a combined impact of both the pandemic and Brexit, creating that perfect storm. And there's an increasing need to flex the offering between the high level veterinary care and a pragmatic approach to veterinary care according to the capacity that we've got in the pet hospitals and in the wider veterinary profession and the resources that we've got available, and taking into account the means of the client to be able to afford that veterinary care. So we at PDSA have always, in order to keep our services accessible to as many pets as we possibly can, provided a pragmatic level of care. And that's something that perhaps the wider veterinary profession should consider as an option in order to help to manage with the demand in a constrained world. So redefining perhaps gold standard to be care that's aimed at achieving the best welfare outcome for the animal, taking into account the care environment and the means and the needs of the owner, rather than providing the very best top level care that is available out there. And of course, this increased demand in the face of constrained capacity can lead to moral distress for veterinary surgeons in the profession. Both they may have to turn clients away, which I know many veterinary practices are at the moment not able to accept new clients, or may have to delay interventions, creating a longer waiting time where previously they may have been able to offer an appointment much sooner. That may well have the impact that veterinary surgeons are having to attend more advanced cases that could have been treated more effectively or differently if they'd been able to see them earlier. And of course, in an environment where clients are less able to afford veterinary care, increased levels of economic euthanasia potentially going forward. So, a number of discussion points coming out of that, and I'm sure there's plenty there for us to discuss in that session. There, we would suggest be an ongoing impact on pet owners, pets, the veterinary profession, and charities that could last for years to come. That we all need to learn from the experience, retain the elements that have worked well, and adapt to the key changing well-being issues of pets and the circumstances of their owners. And a question for the discussion: what might have been considered as fit for the future for charity and veterinary care in a pre-pandemic world may look now very different. So, is just going back to the way things were the right thing to do? I look forward to having a further discussion on some of these matters in the discussion session soon to come. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Caroline Crowe, Head of Training at the Veterinary Defence Society. And I'm going to be talking and discussing the impact of the pandemic on us as people within the profession. So we know that there is a mental health crisis since the pandemic. In May 2021, the ONS statistics showed that depression rates have doubled since the beginning of the pandemic. We know that there are greater inequalities, the young people, disabled, clinically vulnerable, and women are being the most hit. There's decreased access to mental health care services. Mind, the charity, are reporting 2 times more calls than this time last year. And we're seeing that also within vet life contacts being increased. So for many of us in the profession, there are real daily challenges in practice. The profession is under considerable strain. There are significant signs of burnout and attrition in the profession. There's reports of not enough vets, not enough nurses treating an increased number of pets, with 3.2 million households shown to have acquired a pet since COVID-19 pandemic started. So there's increased demands, there's increased workload. And these have increased considerably, especially in small animal practices, but also across the profession. Many teams are recruiting. So people are not working with a full team capacity. Many people are starting their day with either fully booked or overbooked diaries, with no availability for the inevitable emergency cases, no ability to make phone calls, to take designated breaks, to lead teams. And this all leads teams to feel overwhelmed and also burnt out. There's considerable challenge at the moment also dealing with the immediate complaints that we have, that people are talking about, debriefing them, recovering from them as a team. So not only are members of our profession reporting increased frequency of complaints from clients and the client service, but also the increase in negative emotions. And there seems to be a real mismatch of expectations from what the clients are expecting and what we're able to deliver, which are leading to some of these. So we don't feel necessarily equipped with emotional responses to deal with them. And it can leave people feeling drained and also obviously negatively impacted. Historically, as veterinary professionals, we have reacted to everything immediately. There's a problem with a client or a case, we see it immediately. Come down to the practice. I'll come out to you. However, now a mindset shift is required to adapt the message, adapt the expectations, and also to communicate those to our clients and importantly also to ourselves. So changing the expectations around timely, good service. Because the current expectations are not achievable. And if we're not careful, can actually start to create a them and us mentality. So how are we proactively resetting, reapproaching some of the expectations around client service, animal care. What's achievable? What's sustainable? And not with the animals in the forefront, but with the people in the forefront of our mind. What is achievable and what is sustainable for the teams that you have got? What does that look like? Due to a lack of time, we also have a lack of reflective practice, strategic time spent in practice to look at team development, team performance, team efficiencies, because we're too busy doing the day job and not taking time out to proactively reflect and develop. And this can lead to a lack of mentoring, a lack of meetings, a lack of time to do the non-clinical elements of all our roles. What are the consequences if this continues? What are the consequences now for you, your team, your practice, and our profession? We have reports of high levels of workplace stress. We know it's a pressurised environment, but now it's tipping into stress. But not only have we got changes at work, but we've also got changes in how we live. There have been considerable restrictions and changes and adaptations to how we work, how we consult, but also when we work, how we debrief, how we work together, how we socialise, how we switch off, how we go on holiday, all these things that we probably maybe have taken for granted in the past have been severely affected over these last 18 months. And all of this will have a really big impact on the individuals. So how are you working with all those changes? Are you still battling on and trying to carry on as you always have done? What changes have you made? Because we've got increased number of animals. We've potentially got a reduction in the number of practicing vets and nurses. Many people are trying to recruit and therefore working with reduced capacity and resource within their practice. But how many practices have closed their books, have stopped signing up new clients? How many practices are still trying to serve the same number of clients? And if not more clients, with that reduced capacity? What are the consequences? Because we can all increase our ability to perform for a short period of time, but we can't continue that for a long period of time. It's not sustainable for us as individuals, our teams, our practice, and again, for the profession. How long are we going to allow this to continue? What are the consequences for working in this way? How long until customer service, animal welfare, patient care, and importantly, team welfare is compromised? Or are we already seeing some of those signs now? Are we as a profession falling on our own swords to put everything and everyone ahead of ourselves? Is this right? Is this sustainable? Is this professional? And you might be sat here thinking, but I can't do anything else. I need somebody else to change it. Somebody else needs to do it. But it's always asking yourselves, what can you control? What can you influence? What can you take a responsibility for to make the changes that would make a difference at the local level? Because if we wait for others to do something, nothing's going to change. If we hold ourselves to these really high expectations of client care, excellent customer service, quality of animal welfare, etc., how sustainable is that? How are we going to even possibly try and achieve that if that's at our forefront? Should we and could we not put people back at the heart of the veterinary profession? Because when we do that, the outcomes that we will all deliver will be better. Because each and every day, our practices and our people are starting to break. Their welfare is reducing. There are human costs each and every day. And the human cost will have an impact that we will all feel for a significant period of time moving forward from this. So what needs to happen to stem the leaky bucket of human energy reserves to preserve our ability to do a good job and put people back at the heart of the veterinary profession? The reality is the veterinary profession is not about animals. It's all about people. And it's people who drive the animal care, the customer service. It's not done by robots. So why do we expect ourselves and others to work like them? So I'd like to suggest that putting people and focusing on us as individuals and teams is even more imperative than before. So what can we do? Where can we start? This is now not necessarily a time to discuss solutions because the solutions are going to be different for everybody. But I think what we can do is start to talk about expectations, because the difference between expectation and reality for you, your team, your practice, clients, the difference between expectation and reality is frustration, disillusionment, dissatisfaction, and stress. So, when did you last discuss expectations and reset them in light of the changing demands, needs, and environment? We often hear, and I'm sure you've already heard in this talk, talking about gold standard, excellent quality service, excellent patient care, excellence in welfare standards. Well, what's that mean? What resources do you have as a team and a practice to deliver service levels that both you and also your clients expect? Because if we hold ourselves to this gold standard, excellence, and there's nothing tangible there, and either consciously or subconsciously we still keep pushing ourselves from that to that, then we're going to fail each and every day. So have you reset, recommunicated those expectations over the past year or so? What does good quality care look like? What does good customer service look like? And that's not about not doing a good job. That's not about not caring or cutting corners, but it's being realistic with what you can do. So it means about starting to say no, because you need to focus on what you're saying yes to, because otherwise we'll feel unfulfilled, dissatisfied. And that's not it. Those are not good feelings to have. So maybe take a moment and actually just write down, what are the expectations? What do you expect to be able to achieve and to do on a day-to-day basis? What do you expect and achieve? What do you expect and want to do with each of your cases? Are you working in isolation or are you working as a team? Something needs to happen, because otherwise nothing will change. If everything is working exactly how you want it to be, and you are going into work and you're thriving at work and you're gaining energy during the day and you've got energy outside of work for life outside and it feels good and you're buzzing from it, then brilliant, carry on doing what you're doing. And importantly, identify what you are doing that enables you to do that. And if that's not the case, it doesn't have to be like that. You can thrive even though we've got these massive demands on us at the moment, but something needs to change. And we do a lot of coaching on this to help people thrive, no matter what curveballs that they're thrown. So what I would like to suggest is that it's not about the animal welfare. It's not about client care, but it's about people. And if we can get the people part right, if we can look after our teams, which means we'll need to say no to clients. It means to be about resetting expectations. But it's the people that drive the animal care. It's the people that drive the client service. It's the people that drive that team culture. So let's take those 10 steps back and look at the people, because they're the heart of us as the veterinary profession. And I look forward to discussing this with you.
What a schoolboy error. Let's start again. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions so far. 45 minutes or so for a live discussion. Lots of questions have come in already. Please keep them coming in via Slido, the Slido tab in the stage section. Upvote the questions that you would like to hear answered. And just to show that that works, that we listen, question from Maggie Roberts has had more upvotes than anything else. So let me start with this one. Maggie says, I work for CP and our data does not show that more cats were neutered last year, which I think was a point that Peter was suggesting from his research. We normally neuter around 150,000 cats, but could only get 100,000 neutered last year. Peter, you've made the same schoolboy error as me, and I gave you some warning. Do you want to take your mute button off, Peter?
Apologies. Yes, absolutely. I think I said less actually, but if I said more, that's an error in my my comment, because I think we thought there was going to be difficulty getting animals to vets to be castrated. So the routine operations were being suspended. The emergency services were the ones that people were desperately trying to keep going. And I think that was the point I was trying to get across. So if I got my more or less, then I've got a touch of the BBC programme that we all listen to on that.
Steve.
Yeah, I think if I recall, the poor report showed that no significant change. And I think that shows the value of doing different sets of research, because you will always get a slightly different results from different methodologies and depending who you ask and the demographics you ask. So I think each survey or set of data has to be taken on its own merits, and we're happy to compare our methodology and the way that the poor report results have been calculated with how the Cats Protection have come up with theirs.
It also depends, doesn't it, on when exactly your sample is taken, which is a point that Peter was making as well. Daniela.
Yep, so it's actually me that made the comment in my initial video. And I was using the data from the poor report. And the data from the poor report shows that 86% of cats were neutered in February 2020, compared to 90% in May 2021. And I think actually the context of my comment was that at the time, there was a lot of concern that we were going to see a huge population boom in cats because we wouldn't be neutering them. And you know, using the poor report data, it shows that actually that was a welfare harm that didn't obviously transpire.
How concerning is it?
How concerning is
the change in numbers of cats being neutered?
So if I'm looking at the poor report data, I actually don't think it's concerning at all. I actually think it's a good news story that we didn't have a significant drop, because the concern was that we wouldn't be able to neuter them at all. And for the first 3 weeks, neutering was not done. It was emergency work only. And it was the risk that we'd end up in a situation where we were completely overwhelmed, we couldn't neuter at all. And of course, we all know what cats do if we don't neuter them. They have lots and lots of kittens, and then you end up with a bigger problem.
Steve.
Yeah, and the poor report did show, because we'd done obviously a 2019 report and done the data again in February of 2020 and then in August of 2020, it did show that from 2019 and throughout 2020, there was a reduction in the percentage of cats that had been neutered, but that had recovered by 2021 in May when that 2021 report was done. So I don't think there's any doubt that there was absolutely an impact upon neutering rates and neutering levels, but our data would suggest that there has been a recovery since 2020.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to what is a very big question from Julian Kupfer. I'll come to Caroline first because she didn't speak on that last question, but I suspect we'll all have something to say about this. This will not be the last pandemic we will meet. What are the key actions that both the profession and government should put in place? Julian, thank you for the question. Caroline, you're on mute, by the way. That's it. Thank you.
What should they put in place? I don't think we can put anything in place to help next time. But what we can do, what we need to do first of all, before you can decide what we're going to put in place, to reflect on what we've done so far and what we've learned from this one. Because yes, there will be more pandemics. and there'll be more crisis within the profession and within the working world as well. So I don't have anything specifically apart from we need to take some time to reflect, and it's going to be potentially individual, profession, and then parliamentary, and then global as well.
Daniela and then Peter. Daniela?
So I think a couple of things. I think we need to take time to reflect on what has actually worked, because we changed our ways of working almost overnight. And there will be some positives that have come out of it, and there will be some negatives that have come out of it most definitely. And we need to be careful that we don't sort of run towards the normal, what used to be normal, and leave behind any positives that we've developed. There's a bigger issue here that Caroline briefly touched on. We already had workforce issues around, what's going on in the workplace, and I think that COVID just exacerbated it. Speaking as BVA president during the COVID pandemic, who worked closely with government and government departments, I think there's a challenge here in that in time of crisis and a time of pandemic, governments prioritise human health. Naturally, they prioritise food security, they prioritise the basics needed to keep society going. And cat and dog issues would not have been up there. So what I do think is important is that actually that we as a profession hold on to the learnings that we've had, so that next time there isn't the mad change and crazy rush at the beginning.
Peter?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would add to this. I mean, one of the things is the next time will probably not be like this time. There's almost a law in that, I think, somewhere. So being somewhat of grey hair and remembering sitting in the similar chairs to Daniela while BSE was going on as a crisis at the moment, FMD was a crisis at the moment, avian influenza was, etc. The effects that always there is something there, and you have to learn the lessons. You have to learn from what was good, what was bad, what was difficult. I mean, we're still in COVID. We still have got problems with it. We're not doing an analysis at the end of it. We're still there. We've also got on top of it, which I think is quite salutary, we've got the issues around Brexit, the EU exit, which are providing added problems in terms of manpower, in terms of materials, in terms of, certainly on the farming front, how one deals with some of the products of the farming process. So it's rather conflating some of the difficulties. And as I ended up in my last line of what I was saying previously, resilience planning, actually having plans in place, think the unthinkable, think how you will deal with things. What happens if? I think this is something which probably the likes of BVO, working with Carolyn very much on some of the stuff that you've been talking about, maybe that's where we should be as a profession, offering that service to those who have animals as well, because I think we've got the ability and the skills to do it.
Steve, you ended by talking about retaining the elements that have been good, that we've learned during COVID, and you also said is going back to how things were the right thing to do, and the clear implication, if I understood you correctly, was that it wasn't. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, it was a question, but my own personal feeling is that it probably would take us back and away from some real step forwards that we've made. I think I completely agree with Peter in terms of the planning side of things. So pandemics will happen, and other disasters or issues coming along that impact upon any practice's ability to deliver veterinary care will happen, and planning is really key to have on the shelf how you might approach various scenarios or interruption, or what could potentially interrupt your service. So we pulled out our 2009 swine flu pandemic planning document and had worked through that and put in place quite a lot of the mitigations that we thought we would need for 2009, but didn't actually in the end. By the time we entered lockdown, and one of those was the ability to work from home and remotely consult, and that has been absolutely critical to us throughout the pandemic, and especially helped by the Royal College's decision to allow prescribing without physical examination, so that ability to remotely prescribe as well. And we know as a charity that what we want to do is make our service as accessible as possible to people that are eligible for our services, and remote consulting does that for us, and it helps us to reserve the face-to-face service where we've got capacity constraints, even in the best of times with the demand that comes our way quite often, for those cases where we can have the biggest welfare benefit by seeing them in the face-to-face world. So yeah, just as one example, I suppose the remote side is certainly that. We've also prioritized our service, so we focused on delivering that immediate welfare benefit, and if something should happen in the future, we know how we can scale up and down our service to still be able to provide that core life-saving veterinary care.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Danielle, I'll come to you in a second. Caroline first.
Yeah, I think as others have also said, that we're still in it at the moment. So my question is always going to be: do people know what they have learnt so far? And if not, we need to create time in order to analyse that and reflect on that, so that we all need, again, rather than being told to do something, just as individuals and as teams and as practices, we need to have that time in order to think about what have we started since the pandemic that we need to stop now because we did it because of that reactive stage. What have we started that's working really well that we want to amplify and that creates our new way of working? What did we stop because of the pandemic, which actually we need to reintroduce because otherwise we're missing something? And what did we stop that we can actually let go of because it is the old way of working? So I really don't believe that we want to go back to how it was. It's resilience is about bouncing forward, learning, and with that understanding of what we've been through to then create a better way of working moving forward. But we are not through it yet, so we can't have a nice script of what we're going to do next time because there will be a next time. But what we need to do to start off with is to create some time now, and time is the challenge for everybody at the moment. But I would also say what are the consequences of not putting that time in now, to look at what's happening in your teams and in the teams, which will be impacting animal health, animal welfare, but also importantly, the human welfare.
How do you create the time to do that, given what you were saying to us throughout your presentation, which is that you've barely got time to have a cup of tea?
Yeah, so more touch points. So some practices are doing it really well at the moment. There's always the reason of not enough time, and there was pre-pandemic as well. But having touch points throughout the day, which don't mean hours of getting the team together, but it's also setting it as a priority. I think that's what we need to do to start off with. We need to set it as a priority that we have to talk together. We have to have these touch points, which means we are going to have to start saying no to clients. We're going to have to manage those expectations, because otherwise the client's always going to phone. There's always going to be a demand on the team's time. So we can't keep just saying yes, 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 yes. So we've got to start to reset those expectations. And maybe that's to start off with getting some training, but it's really hard which comes first, because when you are tired, you go back to your habits, because it's easier and it takes less energy to do that. So it's really hard to actually just stop, pause, and then start to flex. But and that can only be led by those who are leading the practices. So getting the support for the leaders is really, really critical to give them also the confidence to be able to start to say no, because what we're seeing in some practices, they're doing that and it's working really well, and others are just keep going and going and going and going, and actually the attrition is getting more and more because those within the team are not feeling valued and feel like they're between a rock and a hard place. And then one gets to a point where he thinks, what's the point?
Yeah.
And then they make their decisions.
And it can be led by people who are leading the BVA, like Daniela, who's been nodding empathetically. Daniela.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I now speak as, experience of BVA, but also I'm in practice at the moment, right? So I I understand what it's like day to day on the ground at the moment. And I think there's two things. So I'm primarily going to agree with Caroline, and it will be no surprise to Steve that there's a slight disagreement between him and myself. So in terms of, from my experience, what I think has worked, what I think we should really consider taking forward is, for decades, the profession has said we can't work flexibly. No way. You have to work 8 till 7 or 10 till 8 or whatever. There's no ifs, no buts. And actually, we did it. We had members of the profession who had to stay at home because they had children homeschooling, or that had to change the work patterns. Maybe we should consider doing routines in an evening now. Maybe we should operate on a weekend to try and balance out, when your staff is available and the needs of your staff. So that's one thing. My second point would also be touching what Caroline said, is managing expectations. People go to a GP or to a hospital, get a blood test and expect to wait a week, maybe 2 for the results. We've put this situation where our clients expect the results tomorrow, or even the same evening you took it. And actually, when we have problems with the workforce, when we have increased demands on our services, we need to start managing those expectations to keep everybody happy. And in fact, we have seen some vet practices close their books because they just can't maintain the standard of care whilst keeping bringing more people on board. On Steve's point around remote consulting and remote prescribing, so I fundamentally agree that there is a place for remote consultation. Where Steve and I disagree is around remote prescribing. So I do, the RCVS made an exemption for remote prescribing for clients that you'd never seen before, and you could do it without physically examining the animal. Now, I don't think we have the data to prove that there was a positive or a negative welfare impact here. I think that is the reality of it. We can say that you've done X number of remote consultations, prescribed X number of prescription-only medications remotely, but the reality is we don't have the follow-up, right? We don't know if the right medication was given for the right patient because we never physically saw them. The only way we're going to know if there was a bad outcome is if there was an adverse reaction, for example. So I think we have to be very careful here around talking about remote prescribing as a solution. The more people you have working remotely, the less people you have on the ground, which is also going to therefore impact on those who are still on the ground. So should we be offering remote services within the constraints and constructs of an already existing practice and within the systems that they already have in place? I think it's something that we should be considering, but I think we have to be careful not to overstate the welfare impacts here.
Steve Howard. You're on mute, Steve, sorry.
Oh, there we go. I think it's probably not the place to get into some of the discussions that we've had, Danielle, and say that we have agreed to disagree. I think one thing we did do at the outset of remote prescribing was put in place a clinical governance monitoring system in which we looked at whether our clients were going down the right route. So we tried to make it possible for them to get straight into the face-to-face service if that's what they needed. The clinical decision-making of our vets through our auditors, and the decision made around whether to remotely prescribe or refer into the pet hospital, because they always had that option. And overwhelmingly, those were the correct decisions that were being made. As I showed you, we've monitored some of those patient outcomes as well, and monitored our prescribing behaviours through the number of animals treated, the volume of drugs being provided, and and clinical incidents as well. So we've seen no evidence that there has been any significant welfare impact, negative welfare impact as a result of this. And believe me, if we were seeing that, we would have taken action and not just carried on regardless. So I think everyone has their own points of view on this, and I've been feeding ours in, and we've been having discussions with Daniela and the BVA on this around our differing views as well. Okay. So I think it will come through in the wash, won't it?
Yeah. Okay. I want to move on to other questions. There's lots of them, but Peter, you wanted to just contribute on this one as well.
Well, very briefly to say that I think that you've got two really good subjects for a full discussion there that probably need to be in another place than welfare. But please, let's have some analysis before we have too much debate without it. I notice the medics are now suggesting that maybe the video conferencing they did didn't always give the best of outputs. So I think we just have to listen, learn, analyze, and understand, and not sort of take it as a generality. It may be in certain areas there is value, in others there's not. But we're a scientific body. Let's analyze it, make sure we've got something sensible. And Daniela, I come from a generation where where really pleasure began only when work stopped. My work-life balance sounded a little different from the decades you're talking about, I'm afraid.
Right, it's Steve, 20 seconds, and then I really do want to move on.
Just 20 seconds. I think we also need to be a little bit careful about comparing remote prescribing to a perceived perfection in the face-to-face consulting world as well, because we know mistakes are made in the consulting room, we know misprescribing is made in the consulting room. So when we're comparing it, we need to be comparing apples with apples rather than a perception of how perfect the face-to-face world is or could be.
Thank you. A question from Carrie Westgarth. Did suspending primary vaccinations contribute to the inability to socialise puppies and subsequent behavioural problems being seen? It's not all about disease. Who would like to go first on that one? Daniela.
I'm not sure is the honest answer, because I think there's two components here. There's the component about, you know, us as vets saying your dog should be fully vaccinated before they meet other dogs. But if we also think back to the beginning, this was when we were massively socially distancing. You know, don't leave your house unless you absolutely need to leave your house. If you go to the park, stay well away from other people. So I'm not sure we can answer that or attribute it to one or the other.
Anybody else?
I'd agree with that comment. I think it's my understanding is that some of the behaviorists who are working with dogs at the moment are seeing more cases, but I think that it was the lockdown. It was the inability to get out and have any possible contact. All right, the vaccination is part of that process, but it rather made the point, didn't it?
Okay, let me move to a question from Erica Singh. If I don't ask this one, Erica's probably got an eject button. Someone will just take me out of my seat and out of the conversation. So could there be more reflection on the animal welfare consequences that result from the pressures on vet professionals? Caroline.
We need to look further into the data, and the data we would have to gather from VDS Insurance Company, from Vet Life, from what we're seeing sort of on the ground in terms of probably other surveys as well. So I suppose at the moment we haven't necessarily got that data because again we're not right the way through it yet, are we? So we know that we have. We know that we've got increased. There is I think everyone would recognise there's an increase in complaints. So again, perception, reality, expectations. We haven't completed that circle yet. So that would be my comment at the moment on that.
Daniela?
So I'd agree with Caroline, we're not at the end yet. And I don't think we have the data, but I think even when we do start looking and analysing, I think we're going to find it very difficult to disentangle the results, the consequences on welfare that have come about due to the veterinary profession and the ways we've worked, the consequences directly associated with the pandemic itself, so purchasing decisions, financial implications, etc. And also in the middle of all of this, there's also the consequences of EU exit and so on. So I think, because it's all happened at the same time and it's so complex, I think we're going to end up in a situation where it's going to be very difficult to establish which welfare consequences were attributable to what factor.
Thank you. Peter, go on.
Yeah, one point I think that we do want to see if we can try and get some ideas around is abuse of animals, because I think this is one where we know people have been having difficulties in their households, and we as a profession very often saw animals, were in a position to assist and direct some of the relevant authorities to help. I'm thinking of the Link project, particularly here, which I think is a very valuable entity. And it is something which I think we could do with understanding better, because there are pressures on people, pressures on owners, and those will spill over onto our profession when we can't be sure And when particularly people find difficulty as members of the profession, who to talk to about it, because they haven't perhaps got the usual ways of getting out and having a discussion. That's where the use of email groups, email lists, was absolutely fantastic throughout this whole period of time, and the sharing constantly of concerns done in a way that doesn't compromise the identities of anybody really is helpful. And I'm very grateful to all those who've spent the time putting their comments in, helping others. It really does help the vets, and that helps the welfare.
That leads me in slightly indirectly to a question from Sally Burnell, who asked, at the start of COVID, BVA and NGOs were all advising people not to get lockdown pets, but it fell on deaf ears, as we all know. How do we change? Here's a big question. How do we change human behaviour? Go on, Peter. You've made the mistake of laughing and therefore contributing.
Well, I mean, there's a whole department within Cabinet on the nudge principle and how to do it. And it is totally fascinating the ways in which we are manipulated, sometimes without ourselves knowing. Therefore, I think the point here is that we do have to learn from others. And if indeed the figures and the nature of this does come out to show that it's truly there, and I think there's a little bit of question mark from some of Howard's figures as to quite what did happen. Therefore, we might well learn from some of those bodies and decide what is the best way to do it. But it's got to be the word education, education, education comes out from from the lips of a certain previous Prime Minister, and I suspect that this is really important here as well.
Education at what level and done how? I'll come to Daniela
right the way through,
but at the macro level or the micro level, or how?
Primary to right the way through. There should be proper education with regard to the keeping of animals and respect for animals as a natural part of the education process.
Steve.
Yeah, and I think that is a question that's been around for decades, because we know in the centuries, yes. We know in the Poor Report has shown that a lot of the issues that have to be dealt with in veterinary practices day in, day out are made by poor acquisition decisions of pet owners. And there's all sorts of educational material out there as well to help guide them in that decision making. The big question really is, how do you get them to engage with that education material, and how do you get them to actually change their behaviours? And the nudge theory is one way, as Peter has said, but at what point do you reach a point where you have to start to think out of the box and do something different? And I don't think anybody's got the answer to that will be the silver bullet for all of this. We keep doing the same thing, though. We'll probably keep getting the same result.
Everyone's nodding in a resigned kind of a way. Daniela?
Yeah, I'm not sure education will work in this area. I think, as you say, it's been going on for years and years and years, and there's all the educational material out there, but these are emotional purchases, whether it's emotional because you turn up in a situation and you see a puppy in a poor welfare state and you just can't walk away because you can't leave it, or whether it's an emotional purchase because you're following the latest trends and want the latest flat-faced dog or so on. It's a really difficult conversation. I'm not sure education is working, but equally I'm not sure legislation would work either, because legislation is only as good as the enforcement behind it. So if anyone has any idea, do let us know. I'm sure we'll follow it up for you.
Here's one for Caroline to start on from Helen Armstrong. Could there be a bigger role for veterinary nurses in veterinary preventive healthcare to free up vet time for sick pets as the human medics do?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the I'll say solutions in loosely, one of the ways in which some practices and some teams are working well through the conditions that they're under at the moment is by leveraging. So leveraging the receptionist, leveraging the nursing team, leveraging the vet team, so that people are doing things to the maximum of their ability in terms of what they can do within the rules, but also that there is a flexibility of it as well, triaging. So rather than just a client phones in, they get booked straight into the next available slot. Actually, do they actually need to see a vet? Do they need advice? What do they need, and how could we as a team serve them the best? So yeah, 100% we need to use our nurses better. Yeah.
Peter and then Daniela.
Absolutely. I'm going to just take it into the farming context and just say that whilst there may not be usually veterinary nurses directly, there are some who are very engaged in that, but there's a lot of people in what we would these days term the veterinary team who are ensuring that they cover all aspects. So they might be doing work that will free up the veterinary surgeon. It's something which I think will just develop more. The veterinary technician is perhaps the phrase that has been used, certainly following a little bit the American line. And that concept, whether they're TB testers, certifications, support officers, foot trimmers, whatever, they're real opportunities and careers for other people and supportively within that grouping. And I think that is going to be a really positive way forward for health and welfare, and the way in which some of the thoughts for the future, the welfare and the health pathway, this is really going to be important.
Daniela?
We were already not using nurses appropriately before the pandemic. This isn't something that's limited to the pandemic. We were not utilising our nurses and making the most of their incredible skills beforehand. We need to, as a set of professions, because as Peter's just alluded to, there's lots of us, we need to move to this vet-led team type model where, you know, the vet is there and delegates appropriately. We have Schedule 3 that we could be using. We should be making sure that our nurses are doing everything they can and should be able to do. And then the receptionist can focus on reception duties, cleaners can focus on cleaning duties, animal care assistants can focus on animal care assistants, nurses can be nurses and vets can be vets. But at the moment, the lines are very blurred and there's not sufficient delegation.
So the question that Justine Schott, an AWF trustee, asks, do you think the pandemic has highlighted the need to restructure the veterinary team so we're maximising the potential of all members of the team? Clearly, you all think the answer to that is yes.
It's not necessarily restructure, it's an appropriate delegation, because all the members of the team are there. We're just not using everyone to their full potential. We've got stuck in this rut in some cases. So, you know, what can we learn from the pandemic? Use everybody's skills to their best potential. You'll have a happier team. Everything will become far more positive, and I'm sure Caroline can expand on this.
I was going to say, Caroline, are all your team being used to their full potential?
Yeah, well, I'm not in clinical work anymore, but yes, I think that they probably are. But it comes down to delegation and training people in the non-clinical elements of their job so that they can lead themselves and their team, even without a title of leader. We all have to self-lead. So we all have to self-lead rather than self-micromanage. I think historically, as veterinary surgeons and also veterinary nurses, we're not necessarily good at working effectively, or we don't know how to work effectively in a team, and to utilize the skills across the team. And just because you can do something, it doesn't mean that you should do it or need to do it. Who else could? And again, the challenge is, and it's a real significant challenge, it's time to have these conversations. It's time to know and understand. It's time to train. It's time to manage feedback and give effective feedback. So these are things we work with individuals and teams every day, because we don't have, many teams don't have these skills and are utilizing them on a practical basis on a day-to-day basis, but they can be total game changers for individuals and then the team and then obviously the patients under our care.
So going back to Justine Schott's question, would restructuring or formalizing this force people to make the time that you're talking about, to make it happen?
I don't think we need little boxes for people to work in, because the problem is practice A and practice B and practice C could be totally different. So there's not one size fits all. And I think as vets, certainly as within the profession, we would like to probably sometimes just to be told what to do, and then we can do it, and then we know we can learn it, and then it's like black or white. But it's not black and white. There's so much grey there, and it's being able to work and apply it in within that grey. So for every team to stop to think about what's working, what's not working, and to work within that is the key.
Peter?
Yeah, I don't think we want to beat ourselves up too much on this, because I think we're actually moving in that direction anyway. And I think what this has done is by maybe speeded it up. It's made us appreciate perhaps how we can work better, how practices have had to divide up into teams within the practice has really opened up eyes of what can be done. Certainly on the farm animal side, I think, and food production side, as I said, it was already happening. I'm just thinking of people who are doing lameness scoring, doing obesity work, condition scoring. You know, this is happening. This is the real world, and I think maybe we perhaps review what we've learned, but I'm not sure we need to restructure in perhaps the sense that word is usually used.
Okay. Time is flying. We're having so much fun. We've now got into our last 10 minutes. Here's one for Daniela to start on. How does your description of getting away from reacting immediately fit with RCVS expectations of vets? That's from Madeline Campbell.
I think that's probably my comment about expecting blood results straight away. I think that's probably the link. So I think as a profession, we can triage. We can prioritize. We're taught to prioritize at university, and we have to prioritize. We can't be in multiple places at the same time. There's only one of us, or however many in your team. Our CVS obligation is to uphold animal health and welfare. That doesn't mean it needs to all be done at the same time. You know, if you have an animal that has been lame for a while, fine, get the x-rays in this week, but the vaccination can probably wait till the week after or the one after that. So it's about managing client expectations, but also managing your own expectations and making sure that you're prioritizing cases appropriately and not putting too much pressure on yourself.
I might bring Caroline in on this as well and do it via another question which comes from Catherine Ellis. Reactionary behaviour, inability to be strategic, blurring work-home boundaries affects wider society. How do we get better at moderating societal expectation, which I take to mean the expectation of your customers?
I'll go back to sort of Daniela's point of we need to I think we need to identify what our expectations are first. We can only meet expectations or manage expectations if we know what expectations are. So understanding what we're going to say yes and no to as a team, as a practice, asking then the clients what they're expecting, and then coming together and having a conversation about that and managing those expectations at that point. I think one of the big challenges at the moment through talking to lots of people is people are feeling disillusioned and dissatisfied because they feel they can't do a good job, and they can't provide. I mean, a couple of you we all talked about delivering gold standard. So actually, I think really one of the conversations and the discussions we need to be thinking about for ourselves and also within our teams of what does good look like now? What are we trying to achieve as a service to our clients, as a level of care to the animals, and also importantly, a level of care to ourselves? Because I think we need to be working in a sustainable way. So yes, obviously last March, threw everything at it, totally hit firefighting, reactive state. Fine, that, you know, we're in a crisis, but that crisis didn't last for a month or 2 months. It's now on and on and on and on, and we don't know when the end is. So we need to really have a look at the expectations of what we're doing now, and it's not going to be what we did last February. It's not what we're going to be doing, what we did last April, but actually what is fit for purpose now. And again, to have that thought of we're going to have to keep, it's like just an iteration. It's an iteration of this is what are we going to focus on this week? What are we going to focus on next week? Because we can only do so much. But I think to help us reduce the moral and ethical stress that we are exposed to, we need to start to have some of those conversations with ourselves and with our teams, so that we provide ourselves in a way with our own guidance and our own guidelines, obviously within the wider professional guidelines, but keep hitting ourselves with the gold standard stick isn't going to help anybody.
Would the other three of you, one of you, like to come in on what Caroline said and what she said throughout her recorded talk earlier on, which is essentially we have to be braver at saying to clients, no, we can't look after your pet on this occasion because we have to look after ourselves a little bit. Steve and then Daniela.
Yeah, I think this also links to the pragmatic approach, which we've delivered as a charitable service for many years in order to make sure that our resources can be used to treat as many animals as possible. And a pragmatic approach is about, I wouldn't say it's saying no sometimes, it is about still getting informed consent to do something, but taking that client on a journey with you so they understand your thought processes and will consent to those thought processes. And a pragmatic approach done really well, and that's well understood, and when people believe that it can give good outcomes, and I am being a good vet if I'm doing a good pragmatic approach, can be really good for their well-being. But if it's poorly understood, then it can be damaging, or if it's poorly applied, it can be damaging both for your patients and the well-being of the team as well. So
but Caroline says you actually do have to say no on occasion, or at least not today. Can't do it today, done too much, got to get some sleep.
About managing expectations, but doing it in the right way. So if you just say no, I've got to get some sleep.
I don't mean you use that phrase, but you take that more into account, is what Caroline, if I understood correctly, has been saying.
Yeah, if you don't take the client on a journey through your thought processes, you may well end up in a position of having to defend your decisions or the approach you took later on down the line, because they'll come back and will challenge why you did what you did. So if you say I can't do it today, then you're opening yourself up to that. If you say I can't do it today and this is my reasons why, and it won't impact on the long-term welfare of your pet, and the client agrees with that, then you're at much less risk of ending up with that client coming back to you and making a complaint.
Daniela?
So three things. So I think Steve's comment about pragmatic care, I think that is a big factor here. I think as a profession, and it links back to the debate that happened just before about innovation and over-treatment, we need to reframe what we're seeing as good care. Good care is what's right for that patient and that owner at that point in time, taking into account surroundings, finances, etc. And we need to make sure that we are not feeling like we're failing as vets just because we can't send them off for an MRI, for example, or because we have a dermatology case that we can't give the most expensive drugs to, but actually steroids are going to keep this animal comfortable. So there's that moral challenge coming ahead that I think we need to take into account. Leaders need to lead by example. So if we are saying that you need to take your lunch break, then the practice boss should be going, I'm going for my lunch break now because that phone call can wait, or the vaccine can come in at 4 o'clock rather than at 2:30 right in the middle of my lunch break. So leaders need to lead by example, and it then facilitates the less senior members of the profession to go, okay, I'm seeing that this is okay to do, so I'm going to do it and look after myself as well. But I think Steve has really touched on a big factor here. It's communication, right? So all of this is talking about communication. It's all about how we communicate amongst ourselves, to our clients, to our peers. And I think there is a risk here that we are ending up in an us and them conversation, and that's really not helpful for anybody. It's not helpful for patient care. It's also not helpful for teams because it builds up this feeling of resentment. And if we just take a little bit of time to try and understand where each other's coming from in our conversations, it probably will make everything better.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you in a minute to sum up and just give me some things or a particular thing that's been good to come out of the pandemic. But Peter, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that one of the things that I think I've noticed, and it's something which certainly happened in my career anyway, was that when I couldn't deal with something or another practice couldn't, we rang the other practice and said, please, can you go and see this animal? Can you do so and so? And I've noticed that quite often on some of the web discussions, practices said, look, we've got a problem. Can anybody help? So the animal gets seen. The vets are then feeling great. We've done something positive. And everybody, it squares the circle, if you like, quite nicely. So actually good inter-practice relationships, maybe that's something we should also be working on more to try to ensure that the totality of animals will get care when it's required. And at the same time, we might go to bed occasionally and have a bit of sleep.
Caroline, very quickly to come back on that.
Yeah, so I think the thing is not necessarily we have to say no, because I think that then does, as Daniel says, creates that them and us. But rather than saying, no, I can't see you today, is yes, I can see you tomorrow. When would you like, 10 o'clock or 3 o'clock? Yes, I can see you next week. Yeah, so it's yes, but it's also you're managing the expectation of I'm not just going to say yes now. So that's where we need to change our expectation and that key bit of communication. Because the reality is that, you know, we all need sleep. We're all human. None of us are superhuman. So if we want to look after the animals under our care and look after their welfare, we need to do that with the resources we got. And some of that's going to be time, some of that's going to be people, but we can only do so much. So really thinking about how we can then communicate that, not as a no, well, I'm out of here now, but actually how we can do that in a sustainable way. So yes, yeah, of course I can, but and I can do it tomorrow or Thursday. When would you like?
Okay, I'm going to move on to everyone giving a minute to sum up. I'm going to start with Steve, because if I don't do that, Erica will press that eject a seat button and I'll be out of here. So something positive, you can pick maybe one thing, Steve, that we've changed during the pandemic and is worth holding on to.
For us, I think I probably don't need a minute, you'll be pleased to hear. It's because we've already had a fair amount of discussion there about how, as a charity, we can make our services that bit more accessible to our clients through the use of remote care. And as Daniela says, it has to fit in with the bigger picture of how our pet hospitals deliver their service. But we've made some real strides in terms of the technology that we have put in place to help ensure clients are going down the right routes to get the care that they need at the time they need it, and to help our veterinary surgeons do those remote consultations and do them in the right way and help to make the right prioritized decisions. So from my perspective, the real positive coming out of this is that it will help us in the future to hopefully see more people who are eligible for our services and in need of charitable care.
As soon as you said I don't need a minute, I thought I bet he takes a full minute. He did. Thank you very much, Steve. No, it wasn't over. It was absolutely perfect. Caroline, your turn.
I think we need to just give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back and be a little bit kind to ourselves at this point. We have done so much in the last 18 months, but now maybe what we do need to do is just press pause and just think about, for all the adaptations that we have done, what do we want to continue with and what can we park now as well? But I think just let's be kind to ourselves in this next stage, so that we can then obviously look after the animals under our care.
Thank you, Peter.
Learn the lessons and don't put them on the shelf. That's going to be the usual thing that seems to happen. As I said at the outset, it was unusual in our work because we were looking forwards. We were trying to think what welfare problems might occur. Actually looking forward for some of these things was very instructive, because it also meant that we had to look very hard at who keeps animals, what ways they do, and the extraordinary ways in which the outbreak actually has affected the production methods, the keeping systems, etc. And I think we need to understand in greater detail sometimes the nuances of how we keep animals in this country, because it's the surprise little thing that nips up and says, we've got a real problem here, but nobody had really thought about it before. That's happened in foot and mouth, that happened in BSE. We really didn't understand our industries. And it's important that we make sure we perhaps look forwards and think about the future, what might happen. We'll get it wrong, but it's better that way on occasions than not having done it.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. And Daniela?
So I would probably sum up by saying I think we should all be really, really proud. The profession did an incredible job. And actually, we're talking about animal welfare. There has been no catastrophes, okay? We are actually, tinkering around the edges now and trying to figure out exactly where we can improve things. If people will have heard me say this next line before, but if I've learned one thing is that people matter. Because animal welfare can only be upheld if the people who are entrusted with upholding animal welfare can do their job properly. So we should hold on to the things that we have seen as positives in our workplaces. We should consider those that haven't been so good. But if we look after our people, the people will look after the animals.
that sounded so good as an ending, but can I just press you slightly? Could you pick out one thing that's maybe changed a little bit during the pandemic that's happened because of the pandemic that we hold on to?
I actually think practices were better at working together. You know, that we had seen each other as completely separate organisations and businesses and never speak to each other because we're competitors. Actually, we have spoken to each other and we've worked together to make sure that animal welfare is upheld. And we should keep that spirit day to day, that it's okay to reach out to each other for help.
Brilliant. Daniela, Peter, Caroline, Steve, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you all for your stimulating questions. I hope you've enjoyed the debate. I've certainly enjoyed it as somebody who's looking in from the outside. 30-minute break coming up. I've hit 3:55 on the button, so the ejector button can stay unpressed, Erica. You can network with your fellow delegates. The student research rooms are open again, so you can go and check out any projects you might have missed during the morning break. Students will answer any questions you might have about their projects, and if you come back at 4:25, 25 past 4, there'll be the final research updates with Fiona. Thanks very much.